Good evening, everybody. My name is Sarah Howard, and I'm the Youth and Community Manager here for Danube Regional Library. And it's my pleasure to invite you into our little Zoom room this evening for a panel discussion with parents and volunteers from the Center Project and Parents for Parents on parenting transgender youth. This is co-sponsored with Children's Grove. We are thrilled to be doing some things with them each month, the next 3 months, and then hopefully in the future as well. And right now, I'm going to turn things over to Cameron from the Center Project, who will serve as your lovely moderator for this evening. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much to the library, and especially I want to say a huge thank you to Kim Dude and the Children's Grove for having us be a part of this series. We're really excited for this opportunity to share this information with the community. As was said, my name is Cameron Lee. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm here with the Center Project, which is our LGBTQ community center here in mid-Missouri. And I'm here with several of our fantastic parents with our Parents for Parents group to discuss raising transgender children and teenagers. So in just a second, we're going to hear a little bit more from each of our parents, but I wanted to put faces with names. So if each of you maybe could just like wave and say your name really quick before we get started, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Michelle.
I'm Jen. I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Carol. Christy. And I'm Carol, and I use she, her pronouns.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to get us started. Someone is hammering some stuff. So before we get started, we wanted to do a little bit of a review of the topics that we're talking about this evening, just so we can have some shared language and be on the same page. I'm actually also a volunteer educator with our Bright Education program at the Center Project. And so I took some of our core concepts and put them into a really brief review to just run through really quickly so we can make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about this evening. So when we're talking about the LGBTQ community, people often, mistake some commonly used terms and labels. So it's important to note that gender and sexuality are two different concepts. Gender is an innate sense of being a man or a woman or neither. And it's made up of who we know ourselves to be, which is our gender identity, as well as how we communicate that out to the world, or how our gender expression. Sexuality is also an innate sense of being, but it has to do with who we know ourselves to be attracted to physically or sexually or romantically. And our sexuality is made up of how we identify, our sexual orientation, as well as our choices and behaviors around this. All people have a sense of their own gender identity and sexuality, and we all make choices about how we communicate these parts of ourselves out into the world. When we're talking about gender, sometimes we think of, actually often we think of gender as being binary, or this two-box system that we're assigned to at birth, and comes with all these different social rules and regulations that we must adhere to based on that box. That girls are inherently one way and boys are inherently some different type of way. But the reality is that people experience gender in all kinds of different ways. And in reality, gender is more of a spectrum or even a matrix, as opposed to two separate distinct boxes. So all of us were assigned a sex at birth, male or female or occasionally intersex. And we societally presume people's understanding of their gender based on their sex assigned at birth. Cisgender people are people whose gender aligns with the one that they were assigned at birth. Conversely, transgender people are people whose gender is different than the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth. And people who are non-binary identify their gender outside of the categories of man or woman, or outside of the binary system altogether. Transgender and non-binary people might pursue transition, which can help alleviate gender dysphoria, which is the physical and psychological discomfort that comes from the misalignment between their gender identity and the sex that they were assigned at birth. People can pursue transition steps that are social. So that would be things like using a different name or pronouns, or changing something about their physical presentation like their clothing or their haircut or something like that. They can pursue medical transition, which might be things like hormones or puberty blockers or gender affirming surgeries, or steps for legal transition, which might be changing their legal name or their gender marker. Transition can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, and there is not one single correct way to transition. Some people might only pursue social transition steps or only medical transition steps or legal or a combination of those things. And some people make different choices at different times. The important thing to remember is that studies have consistently shown that transition is directly related to a better quality of life and reductions in negative outcomes like anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and substance abuse. As we're discussing parenting youth, we're talking about young people under the age of 18, and there's a lot of inaccurate information and misinformation about medical transition for young people. And we just want to be really clear and say that there are national medical standards of care and very specific processes and parameters around what types of interventions and steps of transition are available to young people and their families. We know that this conversation is important to be having, and we see this demonstrated in the disparities that are faced by LGBT youth and trans and non-binary youth in particular in their homes with their families and outside of their homes. On the screen, you can see some of these struggles that are faced. And what we know is that parents play a critical, essential role in combating these disparities and creating safe, affirming home environments for raising mentally and physically healthy and well children, which is what brings us to why we're here tonight. Stop my share. So we are here, as I said tonight, to talk to some local parents of trans and non-binary young people about their experiences, some of the lessons that they've learned, struggles, triumphs, joys, words of wisdom for other parents out here in our community. So with all of that being said and a shared groundwork to move from, parents, would you each like to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your story and your journey?
Yes, Cameron. I'm Carol, and my kid is a non-binary lesbian who uses they, them pronouns. In other words, they don't identify as either a man or a woman, and they are attracted to women. So in fact, my kid was only 6 years old when they first realized that they were attracted to girls. And they were terrified because they had never heard the words gay or lesbian before. And they thought there must be something wrong with them. My kid and I have always been close, but they never mentioned any of this to me. Can you imagine carrying the burden of this secret at such a young age and for so long? It wasn't until my kid was in third grade when we were listening to a debate about gay marriage that I defined the words gay and lesbian for them. And as they questioned me about it, I explained that we should be accepting of gay people and their right to marry. But the fact that our country was having a debate about whether gay people should have the right to marry was not lost on my kid at the time. The message that they unfortunately received was that in our society, gay people were somehow less than heterosexual people. My kid didn't finally come out to me until they were 13. They had seen a girl at the farmer's market that they were so attracted to that they couldn't deny it any longer. Mom, I think I might be bisexual, they said very tentatively. The timing was not great. I was stressed out about being admitted to the hospital for a heart procedure, and my kid was so tentative about their announcement that I thought they were uncertain about it. I thought it was probably just something they had read on the internet. I said, I don't think you are, and explained something about a study I had read. I thought that since my kid and I were close, that I knew them better than they knew themselves. I now call this parental arrogance. Also, our society is so heteronormative and cisnormative that most of us assume our kids are both heterosexual or straight and cisgender. These expectations can make it very difficult for our kids to come out. And they can also make it very difficult for parents to realign our expectations when our kids do come out. My kid didn't attempt to come out again for 2 more years. This time they were determined, and they came out yelling about how stupid I was, that I didn't realize that they were bisexual. That got my attention, and we spent a long time talking about it. They were eager to come out to the rest of the family, and most of the family was accepting, although not as fully understanding as my kid would have liked. A year later, my kid came out as a lesbian, and then shortly after that as non-binary. My kid is now 22, and our journey continues.
All right, thanks, Carol. My name is Jen, and I use she, her pronouns. I have 2 kids. My 19-year-old daughter is transgender, and I have a 16-year-old cisgender daughter. My daughter came out to me when she was 13, just a few months shy of her 14th birthday. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. We all think we know our kids so well, and I knew which of my kids would freak out in what type of situation, who was likely to forget to do their homework, who would be insecure about a school dance coming up. I mean, I kind of thought I was rocking this parenting thing. And then to have your child tell you that you didn't know this huge part of who they are, it's really hard to understand and take in. I'd like to say that I did all the right things and I didn't mess up, but that would just be unrealistic. But the big thing is I listened and messed some things up, and then I listened some more, and I sought out help for my kid and for myself, because I learned very quickly I had no idea what I was doing. But like all children, if you come from a place of love and acceptance, that's the best place to start. Pretty soon into our journey, I was on a trip with a few friends, and I told them about my daughter coming out to me. And they just happened to have a really good friend with a transgender child. So she introduced me, and we soon became good friends. And that was how I was introduced to Parents for Parents group, which we'll talk about later in our discussion. Looking back on my kid's childhood, I should have seen this about her. But we're handed this kid in the hospital, and we're told one thing. And then we spend all this time putting them in a box that we are told to put them in. And I think the main thing I want parents to know is to let your kids out of that box that you're told they're in. I saw so many signs that I reframed that I was seeing from this narrative of what I've been told. And if I just listened and believed what I was seeing, instead of trying to fit them in that box, perhaps our journey would have started much sooner and without so many rough patches.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle, and my husband and I are parents to 4 children, and one of those kids is trans. My child came out to us about 8 years ago when he was 16, but he had actually struggled privately with his identity for at least a few years before he shared it with our family. And even though he grew up knowing that our family honors and respects everyone, and it would have been a safe space to come out, it was still extremely difficult for him to disclose that part of himself to us. That still surprises me to this day, but I do hear that from a lot of other families. During that time, I wasn't really familiar with what it meant to be trans, and I will be perfectly honest, it hit me like a ton of bricks. My first thoughts wavered between finally having words to attach to the path that my child had struggled on, and at the same time, I struggled with this fear that I had for his safety and for the overwhelming amount of change that we were getting ready to experience. This was back in 2015, and I was first researching information about the trans community, but there was relatively little information available compared to what you will find today. Probably for every half dozen doctors I called, maybe one was even familiar with the term, which also surprised me. And I always seek out research-based information, and that was very difficult to find at that time. I am a preschool teacher and early childhood educator, and I feel like that experience was very helpful to me. It gave me a baseline of knowledge, but I knew that I needed more support so that I could support my child. And that was 8 years ago, and each day is changing for the better. Fortunately, there have been many positive, what we call trailblazers that have made it a little bit easier for Noah to feel supported. Way back in 2015, when Noah first came out at the university, he and I attended a couple of conferences. One was Laverne Cox and another was Kai Allums, who are both trans people in our community. And we just soaked up every bit of information we could find. Over the last several years, I've met several other families in Columbia that have young children going through different stages of the same process. It's always kind of exciting for us to see that so many people are going through similar things, and we can share with each other and learn from each other. Almost immediately, when Noah first came out, we learned about the Center Project here in Columbia. And Noah started attending monthly meetings with PRISM, which is the youth-centered group. And to this day, I credit that experience with transforming his life. Not long after that, I found the Parents for Parents group, and I've been active in that ever since. As a family, we support our child, and we have learned so much about the struggles that so many young trans people go through when they ask for help from their families. And we've been a little disappointed to learn that not every child is supported in that way. The suicide rate for transgender kids is astronomical, and we were determined for that not to be the fate for our child. It is greatly reduced when they have at least one supportive adult in their lives. And we were determined to make that happen. Noah is the same amazing person that we have always known, and we came to learn that we were all just calling him by the wrong name. It was very hard in the beginning, and we're still having hurdles once in a while, but those hurdles are outweighed by all the amazing days that we have with our amazing kid.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Christy, she, her pronouns. My husband and I are raising 5 kids, and among them we have a bi-trans son who uses he, him pronouns, and another kiddo who identifies as pansexual and non-binary and uses they, them pronouns. My husband and I have been involved with TCP and in advocacy for the LGBTQ community for well over 20 years, we'll say, and mostly took our kids' identities in stride. Our son likes to joke that we actually screwed up his whole coming out because he doesn't have any awful parent stories to tell. And our 2 kids had these completely different journeys to becoming the folks that they are today. Our son came out as gay when he was 17, then after his first year of college as trans, and shortly after that as bisexual. And his experience was pretty different from these others that you've heard about, because he was well into his 16th year before he had any inkling about this part of himself. And when he started to figure out, it came as quite a bit of a shock to him. And so for him, despite growing up in our family, going to LGBTQ rights marches and spending time with our queer friends, he was still worried about coming out to us, not knowing if we would extend the same love and grace to him that we had to other people that he was aware of. He was also, I think, pretty worried about the reaction to our extended family, knowing that there were a lot of folks who maybe held different beliefs than what we hold in our household. But our youngest kiddo, so they never really loved labels. And so I used pansexual and non-binary at the beginning in my introduction. If it were up to them, there would be no labels, but when they're pressed into a corner, those are the ones that they say describe them the best. This kiddo seemed to just take all of their sexuality and gender identity variables in stride. These facts about themselves were just facts about them, and there were no big pronouncements or no defining moments. There were just these normal conversations starting around age 14 about a crush on this girl or that person, beginning to cultivate and be surrounded by this big gang of queer friends, and then just being a huge, loud, vocal advocate, kind of like us, for LGBTQ rights. And so it made it really easy for me to look at their experience and think, you know what, I don't know if this is as real as their sibling. Maybe this is just part of that artist persona, that they're cultivating. And one of the things that I wish, looking back, is that I had listened more closely so that I could actually understand the realness of those moments so much earlier than I did. The other difference between the two is pronouns. And while they both spent some time using they, them pronouns, for our youngest kiddo, they, them is the best pronoun for them to use kind of long term. And so while the willingness is there on my part, I have had to spend so much time retraining my binary brain that's been a real struggle for me to get those pronouns right. And I'm super thankful that my kiddo has been super patient with me on that. And as a family, we really kind of opted to treat all these milestones kind of like we would treat anything else. And so our Christmas letter has little tidbits and sometimes education to help our family along the path to respect and acceptance of our kids. It's not always been an easy path. We both have family members who have been completely unwilling to understand or uninterested in showing our kids respect. Thankfully, we also have family members who are totally on team our kids. So the reaction to behaviors of our extended family have in a lot of ways been probably the most challenging part of my experience as a mom and the most hurtful, part of this for our kids. So we are super grateful to have a full circle of grandparents who just love our kids as they are and took it upon themselves to educate themselves. And I'll also say that Parents for Parents has been a godsend at times when things became more challenging for us.
Thank you all so much for sharing your stories. And I want to say something in particular. Michelle, you mentioned, seeing like Laverne Cox and some other folks, and speaking to how helpful it was to have other people to look at and learn from. And you all are here playing that same role for our community. And I just want to say thank you to each of you and to your families for being willing to be here and sharing your stories. You've already touched on like so many important things that I'm sure are meaningful for folks that are listening, parents and kids. So thank you all so much. So let's jump in just like right at the very beginning. So when your child comes out, there's obviously a lot of questions and feelings that are naturally going to come up for parents. What was your experience as a parent when your child first came out? I think we're starting with Carol. Oh, you're muted, Carol.
There we go. So most kids are afraid to come out to their parents because they fear being rejected. I was astonished to find out that my kid was terrified of coming out to me. I mean, me. So, but the unfortunate fact is that some parents do reject their children at this stage, and some kids become homeless as a result. So most kids have delayed coming out to their parents for a long time, and they have been on this journey for a long time before finally coming out. And most parents have never even considered that their kid could be transgender or non-binary. So we have this mismatch. The kid is way down the road on their journey, and the parent is way far behind, knowing very little. The kid feels very vulnerable after coming out, having revealed a great deal of himself, and the parents feel overwhelmed and confused. And since the parents know so little about transgender people, they are prone to missteps and to saying things that might, anger or upset their kid. So it can be a rocky road, a rocky time in the beginning. Finally, many parents feel a sense of loss when their child comes out as transgender. Sometimes a parent needs to mourn this loss. For instance, maybe a kid is changing their name from a beloved family name. But frequently that loss that a parent feels is just an expectation that their child is going to be changing. However, the reality is usually different. The kid may be changing on the outside, like with clothes and hair and so forth, but the child themselves remains the same. The change that does occur is a positive one. The child blossoms usually as they become a more authentic version of themselves. But initially, when a child first comes out, you can have this mismatch. The kid is excited as they are gradually accepted, and the parent is overwhelmed, uninformed, and feels like they're in mourning.
I know we're going to end up talking about this a little bit later, that the article, the blossoming child, what is it? Blossoming child?
Mourning parent.
Mourning parent, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just so interesting, the gap that exists for the kid who is finally coming out, and then the parent who it's maybe new information for them, and they're having to make all of these adjustments, and all of a sudden now kid and parent are into totally different places. But I also think, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think that it's beautiful to see the ways that parents and kids can catch up with each other and converge when they, the parents end up being in a supportive space for their kid, and then the kid can really blossom and have that trust relationship with their parents. It's really cool. So what, just literally, so what do you do when your child comes out to you?
Well, I think I'm up next. So one of the first things that surprised me the most when my child came out to us was how difficult it was for them to approach us, which I mentioned earlier, how long it took them to muster up that courage, knowing that in our family in particular, we've always been very vocal to all of our children that we are accepting and we love them for who they are. But my child still had a difficult time coming forward. In fact, they told me later that for a couple of years prior, they would drop hints about their friend's sexuality or mention things in passing with regard to gender, just to gauge my reaction. And they did tell me that I always had a positive reaction, so that was good. But my child said that even though he knew that deep down he would be offered love and acceptance, he was still just incredibly nervous that his true identity would be the one thing that would break us. And that apprehension was what caused him to come out to us later than he wanted to. And that just breaks my heart. But knowing that, I realized how important it is to show and tell your child over and over again how supportive you are from a very young age. And when you think your relationship couldn't get any closer, there can still be times when your child just doesn't feel that validation. So when my child came out to me and I was aware of that hesitation, I personally made it a point to remind him how much we love him. And I do that to this day. And I've also come to understand how important it is to trust that my child knows himself. I think there came a time much earlier than I would have expected that I realized my child knew himself not only as much as I knew him, but better. In my experience, it is typical that when some children come out to a trusted adult, they have spent a considerable amount of time before that day. In my child's case, years processing their feelings, researching, learning about others with similar experiences, and just figuring out who they are. So for us to downplay that process, I think is not acceptable. They have not come to us typically just discovering it the day before. They have likely spent countless hours figuring this out. Something that gets mentioned in our Parents for Parents group a lot is when an adult is questioning how a young person can really know whether or not they're trans, is whether or not that child is insistent, persistent, and consistent. And we have found that when a child is unwavering, continues fully, even when they are faced with opposition, and they are unchanging in their knowledge of themselves over a period of time with regard to their own identity, then as parents, we need to trust them. Another memory I have from when my son first came out is realizing how little I actually did know about his new identity. Like I said before, I didn't really know very much information about the trans community. And I found myself leaning on my child for that information. And he was glad to help me along my journey. But I quickly realized that it really could be a burden to him to walk this new path for himself while also having to help and support me along the way. So I made it a point to seek out other adults that I could share this experience with and learn from without saddling my son with the obligation of making sure I had that support. And that's how I stumbled upon the Center Project and Parents for Parents.
We actually had a question in the chat about what is Parents for Parents, and I feel like everything that you just said demonstrates exactly what Parents for Parents is and why it exists, which is to access information and support in the process of learning and seeking other parents in your process, rather, as you said, than putting the burden on your child to do all of the education, of course.
Right. And sometimes it's information that we share with each other. Sometimes it's a struggle, But a lot of times, I would say most of the time, it's sharing successes that our kids are having and just treasured moments that we want to brag about. I feel like we all know each other's kids so well through that experience, even though many of us have never met each other's children. So it is an amazing group.
That's really cool. Well, our community is so lucky to have a group like Parents for Parents. Carol, you're also one of the coordinators for Parents for Parents. Did you have other ideas, tips, and things about when your kid comes out?
Yes, Cameron, I do. First of all, no matter what you're feeling when your child first comes out to you, and you'll be feeling all sorts of things, offer your love and support. Say something like, I know it took a lot of courage for you to tell me this. I will always love you and I will support you on your journey. And if this isn't what you told your child when they first came out, then go back to them and apologize and tell them that now. You can always do what we call rewind. Go back and say, I'm sorry, I screwed up. This is what I meant to say, or this is what I'm saying now. This is how I feel. Second of all, you need to get support for yourself because you have a lot to process. This could be a therapist, a knowledgeable friend or family member, or a group of parents of LGBTQ youth, like the Parents for Parents group at the Center Project. So, and I highly, again, you're hearing a lot about Parents for Parents, but there's a reason for that. I highly recommend Parents for Parents. I wish it had been available to me when my child first came out. And use caution when relying on therapists and friends and family members, unless you know that they are knowledgeable and trans affirming. For instance, shortly after my child came out, a child psychiatrist told me that he didn't think my child was bisexual. I was fairly certain that my child was bisexual, but when I tried to discuss this confusion I was having with a friend and then with a family member, they at least partially supported the psychiatrist's view. So had Parents for Parents been in existence at that time, I'm sure they would have given me better guidance. They would have said something like, take your child and run, don't walk away from there. So, which I, wish I would have done. Which leads me to the third thing you need to do, which is educate yourself. And please see the resource list that we have compiled. This will help you dramatically and will help you close that gap between where your child is far down the road on their journey and where you are, which is far behind. The fourth thing you need to do is to trust your child and what they are telling you about themselves. They are the only one who can know about their identity. No matter how close you are to your child, and this is a mistake that I made, you cannot know them better than they know themselves. And finally, listen to your child, really listen. You will learn a lot. You will grow closer to your child, and it will help you close that gap again between where your child is on their journey and where you are on yours. And these personal experiences of your child cannot be found in books. So that's my summary of the major points of what you should do when your child comes out.
That's excellent. You are very good at just like laying down the structure. Here's what it is.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah. Those are great. I wanted to side note about when you're looking for a safe healthcare provider, that TCP just last fall was able to launch a community curated safe healthcare provider list. And so that is a resource that's available on our website for the community for parents. And also another, I'm gonna toot P4P's horn for a second, but y'all also have created resources to help support parents as they're searching for different resources in the community. So that would be another great way to plug in with P4P. Shifting gears just a little bit, Jen, what are some of the struggles that your child has faced in their process of transition, and how have you all as a family or you as a parent dealt with those challenges?
Yeah, thanks. First and foremost, this is a struggle and a journey for your child, and they need a lot of support and love. But also, there's a lot of changes for the whole family that take place. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I made initially was not realizing how much these changes were affecting my cisgender daughter, who is about 2.5 years younger. And up until this point in her life, she was the only girl in our family, not just our immediate family, but also the only granddaughter on both sides of the family. So not only was my transgender daughter struggling with how to share and transition into her new life, but my cisgender daughter was struggling with how she viewed as a transitioning role for her in the family. And I didn't see that until later. So it was almost like I'd kind of gotten on blinders. And as I worked on getting through the day-to-day things, as we worked on school and therapists and doctors, for my transgender daughter, I wasn't really seeing the forest for the trees when it came to the rest of the family. So that's one thing I would caution, is that this isn't just a journey for your transgender child, it's a journey for the whole family, and that everyone needs some support. And if I could go back, I would make sure that I was checking in and getting support for all of the family at the beginning and as we went through this. Sports are another thing that becomes much more complicated when you have a transgender child. If your child wants to participate in sports through the schools, there is a process to do so, but it is very long and a complicated process, and it does take time. So my child did go through that process, so I have some experience with it I wanted to share, because if you have a transgender child, you do need to be aware that it is a long process. The child must have gone through has to fill out some forms. They must have gone through medical transitioning for over a year. And then they also have to provide letters that state your child is socially transitioned, as well as provide school transcripts. So it's not like your child can just decide, I am now transgender, I am going to play on the sports team for girls. So this idea that trans female athletes come out and immediately start playing on the girls' sports team is a fallacy in Missouri. And it's clearly being misrepresented for political purposes right now. Transgender students just want to have the same opportunities to be part of their school community like their cisgender peers.
Yeah, thank you. There is, I mean, we said this at the beginning, there's a lot of misinformation, either ignorance or willful misinformation that happens around a lot of issues facing the trans community, and particularly right now, trans women and girls. And we could have a whole other conversation about why that's happening, but I do want to say thank you so much, Jen, for your correcting that information and sharing your story, and for your advocacy on behalf of your daughter. It matters a lot.
Thank you.
So what becomes the role or responsibility of a parent when your child comes out, as far as, y'all have kind of talked about this a little bit, but as far as navigating the relationships with other family members and other family dynamics? What's the role of the parent in that process?
Yeah, so I'll start. Whenever Noah first came out to us, pretty quickly, we asked him how he would like to handle making kind of like the announcement to friends and family. And with his help, we created a letter that we sent to people closest to us, kind of a smaller circle. And then eventually we made the circle a little bit bigger to extended friends and family. And some of the things that we included in that letter were how much we love and support our kid, an announcement of their new name and pronouns, some links to some research-based education so they could learn more, and then some tips on what they can do if they accidentally misgender our child or use the wrong name. And I made it clear in those letters that we expected those people close to us to support our child. And I also asked that they not assume that they had permission to ask personal questions that would cross boundaries of privacy. And we understood that this change might be tricky to navigate, but we still expected their full support and respect for our child. Another responsibility I took on when my child was younger was handling social situations when we were out and about in the community. After having several experiences, either going out to eat or shopping, and having a staff member greet us as ladies, if it were my son and myself, I just one day asked my son, how do you want me to handle if that situation happens? Rather than jumping up and making an assumption about how it should be. I just talked to him directly, and he said that his personal choice was that if we were in a regular establishment that we might return to later, then yeah, it'd be okay to step up and, mention that they made a mistake. But if it was someplace we probably would never go again, he was fine to just let it go and move on. It's very difficult as an adult, as a parent, to hear your child misgendered, especially knowing how much of a sting that can be when your child hears it so regularly. So my protective instinct often kicks in, and I find myself regularly calling him by his name and using his pronouns a little bit louder in front of the staff, just because I want to kind of set that example. Or, maybe if we walk into a place, we always talk about if we walk into some store with a lot of conservative ladies, then we sometimes kind of expect that, he might get misgendered. And so in those instances, a lot of times I will, on purpose, use his name repeatedly. And I actually talked to him about that this evening. We were remembering those experiences. And he said, I don't really have that. That doesn't bother me as much anymore. I'm kind of past that. But he does those same things to support his friends. So when his friends and him are out in a social situation and he feels like maybe one of his friends might get misgendered, then Noah takes on that role and sets that same example. So I'm really proud of him for that. And I'm glad he shared that with me. So no matter how old they are, I just believe it's our responsibility to put our kids' needs first. I'm willing to help somebody learn, and I'll definitely make an effort, but ultimately my responsibility is to provide a safe space for my kid. And that's just something that I will not compromise.
And I'll jump in, and I want to echo what Michelle started with and say that first and foremost, one of our jobs is to ask our kids what they want and need from us, and then to respect that no matter how old they are, right? That's true from early on to our grown children. And also to check in from time to time, because what they want and need might change based on the circumstance or based on the person or the people involved, or as Michelle alluded to, based on just time and their own process. I think the way we choose to inform people is a really, I think, important process for a whole family. And so I want to mention really quickly, we did that in a way that's similar, but pretty different also from what Michelle and her family did. We announced these things in our Christmas letter under the heading of celebrating our kids. And so we just sort of made it a normal part of our lives, right? Like, this is normal for us. It's normal for our kids. It's normal for all of you as well, right? And so it went something like, hey, we're so excited that this kid and his wife just produced this beautiful human, our first grandchild. We're really excited to introduce you to this new name of child. And we're so proud of all the work that he's done to become who he is. And then we're really excited for this child who's moving to this town with this person, their partner, to begin their journey at this art school. And so we just sort of rolled it all in together. Like, it's just all part of who we are, because, spoiler alert, it's all part of who we are. But if I could say, one thing to parents, to grandparents, to that larger family community, because all of you are so important, the greatest gift that you can give is to believe the kid, to respect the kid, and to accept the kid. And if you've got folks in your lives who can't get there with you, stand up and, assuming your kid's on board with this plan, become the warrior for your kid, right? They are dealing with so much stuff that they really shouldn't have to fight for their place in your family or their place in the community or your church or their school. That's my job in my household, right? I am the warrior for my kids for all things where they need that warrior. And I think, it's our job to, and I think Michelle alluded to this too, explain it, to answer the respectful questions. I don't answer the disrespectful questions, but I'm going to answer every respectful question so my kid doesn't have to do that. I'm going to provide the educational resources. I'm going to send the book, the article, the videos to those people in my family who maybe are trying to get there, right? That they want to do that, but they're not there yet and they need a little bit. I'm also going to give my kids the choice of where they go and who they spend their time with, Christmas at grandma's is no longer a sacred thing at our house. Our kids get to decide, do I go and be dead named and misgendered? Or do I figure out a different way to do that? And maybe our whole family does it in a different way to support that kid. But there are also times when it's really important, when my kids want to be in that place, want to be at that family event. And in those circumstances, we have a conversation beforehand of like, okay, what are we going to do when so-and-so misgenders you or dead names you? And then we stick to that plan. So sometimes it's just don't say anything and let me get through it. Sometimes it's just don't say anything, let me get through it, but later take them down. Sometimes it's call it out in the moment. I don't care what you say, beat them down. And other times it's like, I've got this. And in those circumstances, we kind of stick close and we have our kids back and reinforce them, if they need that, particularly with some of the older family members that they may run into. I think, the bottom line for our family has been that we expect our extended family members to respect and support our kids. And if you're unwilling to do that, mistakes happen, like we get mistakes. If you're making the effort, we're going to embrace that. But those folks who are unwilling to respect our kids, who intentionally go out of their way to do hurtful things, dead naming, misgendering, among other things, they don't get to come to our house anymore. They don't get invited to our things anymore. So I think a couple of us have mentioned that we sort of become that mama bear or that warrior. And I really do believe that that's a big part of what my job is. And I say all this stuff, and Michelle said it too, like it's easy, right? We've been doing it for a long time. It's gotten easier over time, but I will tell you it is not easy. I don't love conflict. Like a lot. I don't love conflict. And I have done so much conflict because I didn't want my kids to have to do that, right? That's on me to stand up and do that work for them. And I've had to make some really hard decisions about who gets to come to this event or that event and what events we attend as a family and who gets our Christmas letter after many years of some of the responses that we've gotten. And that's been really hard on me. My husband seems to make it look pretty easy, but I think there have been times that's been hard on him as well. And you know what, when I look back over, gosh, it's been 10 years now that we've been on this journey with our kids. And when I look back over that time, I would be that warrior 1,000 times over, because at the end of the day, our kids know that they are loved, that they are worthy, and that we believe in them. And really, that's what it's all about for me.
That is so nice to hear. Some of what you're talking about is related to the next thing that I was going to ask, which is that, like, obviously transition is quite a process for the person who is transitioning, but it is, as we've said several times, it's also a process for the whole family and for parents specifically. So I'm curious, like, what has the process been like for you, and how have you or your family changed?
So I'll go first. For us, the process within our immediate family was probably trickier for my husband and myself with regard to the change in pronouns. That was one of the trickiest tangible things. Our other three kids made the switch almost immediately, never looked back, and they rarely, if ever, messed up. My husband avoided the use of pronouns out of fear of messing up for quite some time. I'd say over a year, even longer. It was just really hard for him to switch, and he put a lot of pressure on himself not to mess up. So he would just avoid it altogether, and he would say things without using any pronoun just to avoid it. I would always hear it. Unfortunately, when you do that, I feel like most of the time your child notices. So I would advise parents to just try your best, acknowledge politely when you mess up, and then move on. And that's another thing that I actually spoke with Noah about. I said, what do you want me to do when I mess up? And he in particular said, and everybody might be different. He said, don't fawn all over it. Don't go on and on and on about how sorry you are. Just say quickly, oh, I'm sorry, I meant he, and move on. Don't make a big deal out of it. And so, and in talking to Noah about this also tonight, he says that he never did notice that his dad didn't use pronouns all that time, which I'm really happy, because I worried so much about that because I was so hyper focused on doing it correctly. But I would mess up. And when I would mess up, I would beat myself up. I would just think back on it and wish I had never said that thing and try to figure out what can I do better next time. But honestly, you just have to, you're coming from a positive place. You're not trying to be, make that mistake. So just give yourself some grace and move forward. I guess I would say, another difficult part of that transition as a family were the constant reminders of times when you were using the wrong name and pronouns, which is kind of how we reflect back on that time before Noah came out to us. So for me, it would come up when I would be on my computer and file names with my child's name would pop up. So I just went through every file on my computer that reflected my child's name and made sure it had the correct name. And I switched out photographs in the house so that they would be photographs of times when he was wearing clothes that more represented his actual gender in place of older photos that showed him wearing clothes that didn't really match who he is. And that kind of thing may not be important to every child. So I think it's really important to ask your own child what would make them most comfortable. That language from muscle memory is also really tricky. So I would look for safe places to practice, like when I would get my hair cut and the stylist would ask me about myself or my kids, I would just immediately start describing my kids using this new name and pronoun so that I could kind of practicing it out loud without worrying about messing it up in front of somebody that I knew better.
That's awesome. Those are such like tangible, like active, tangible things that you can do. And it makes such a big difference for kids to use their correct name and pronouns. That's one of the biggest ways that parents can demonstrate support, especially early on. And so having those like tips and tricks for practicing and the reminder that like, it's okay to make mistakes. That's one of the things we talk about in our Bright training is just like that, exactly what you said. You cannot fawn all over it. You just move on. You're coming from a place of love and you just keep moving. Yeah. Carol, what has the process, transition process changed for you and your family and your experience with your child?
Well, as I mentioned, my child had been on their solitary journey, so terrified about their classmates finding out that they were attracted to girls, that they tried as hard as they could to act straight. This went on for years and was very socially isolating for them. They were such a good student of all the nuances and details of how to act like a straight girl that I never even remotely suspected that my child was a lesbian. So when my child finally did come out, at first it was quite a surprise. And there was a bit of a rocky period because I was so far behind on my journey and would say things that were uninformed or, would offend them. But as I gradually came to accept my child and support them, I found that we grew closer again. And I began to see the world through their eyes. And that made me a better, more compassionate person. I began to understand the privilege that I had as a straight cisgender person, all those benefits you have that you don't even realize you have. For instance, you never have to come out to your friends and family and say, guess what, I'm straight, or guess what, I'm cisgender. You don't have to worry about being misgendered when you go out socially, or about a teacher using your dead name in the middle of class. You don't have to worry about a medical provider misgendering you or dismissing your concerns. These are all constant sources of anxiety if you are cis or transgender, and things you don't even have to consider if you are straight and cisgender.
I want to say out loud, we have about 6 minutes. And so I want to encourage folks who are watching, if they have questions, to go ahead and send them into the chat because we can see them. And if we go a few minutes over, it's no big deal. But it would be great to go ahead and get those in if folks do have questions. I'm also going to share my screen again. We mentioned earlier the article, Blossoming Children, Mourning Parent. And Carol, I think you're going to share some more specific words of advice about.
Yeah. Why don't you wait just a minute? Wait just a minute to share your screen. Okay. So my specific words of advice are that it all starts with making the decision to support your child. And there was a study done in Canada of 36 transgender kids who were beginning their transition, and one parent for each child. And they did in-depth interviews of the kids and the parents and published the results in a study called Blossoming Child, Mourning Parents. And a link to this, I think Cameron just said that a link to this study is under the resources section in the chat, is that right?
Yep.
Okay. And one of the findings of the study was something called the Virtuous Circle of Support. Yeah.
Give me a share it?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't ready.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, anyway, I can start talking about. So, okay.
Here we go.
Oops, now I have to enlarge here. So as you can see, at the top circle is when the parent begins, there we go. When the parent begins to support their child. And what this leads to is it allows the child to be more authentic. And that allows the child to feel happier. And then the parents see the child feeling happier or being happier, and they feel good about their support that they're giving. And so then they go on to continue to support and give and advocate for their child. So that is the most essential piece, I think, to parenting a transgender child or a non-binary child, is to support your child. Just start with supporting your child. So there's also nothing quite like the support provided for you as a parent by parents of other transgender and non-binary kids. And so that's, so I'd urge all of you also, I guess what I'm saying is this, my second piece of advice is to all of you who have transgender kids or grandkids to become a member of Parents for Parents. And that's, again, the Center Projects group for parents of LGBTQ kids. And we meet twice a month, either in person or via Zoom. And we have a private Facebook group. And we share resources and experiences and celebrate each other's successes and generally provide support. And this is essential because most of us don't know other parents who have transgender kids. And it can be a very lonely feeling. And no matter what issue you are facing, there is almost always someone in the group who's been there, usually multiple people. So I highly recommend you join. And just finally, just to summarize what we've been talking about and what to do when a child comes out to you. Begin by offering your love and support, no matter what you're feeling. Get support for yourself. Educate yourself. Trust your child and what they tell you about their identity, and listen to your child. And finally, know that you will make mistakes. All of us have, and that's okay. You can forgive yourself.
Christy, did you want to say, we have just a few minutes. I was going to pull up this chart that we have that really demonstrates the impact of parental support. I'll pull it up on the screen real quick.
Okay, as you're doing that, I'll go ahead and start chatting since I know we're close on our time. Cameron mentioned earlier just a lot of the health inequity and the negative health outcomes for trans kids and for trans people in general. And I think, one of the things that I think happens a lot of times is we see those statistics that say things like, trans people are more likely to die by suicide, and we make this assumption that it's because something is broken in that person, right? There's something wrong or bad or just not right about that person. But what I love about this data is that it so clearly demonstrates that it's not the person, it's the environment and the people around that person that make the difference. So when we look at this first, the first graph, the The bright blue represents experiences of youth with parents who are very supportive. And then the lighter blue represents the experiences of youth who have parents who are less supportive or not supportive at all. And I think, what you'll notice if you take a look at that is that supportive parents are connected to significantly better quality of life and sense of self. So those kids who have parents who got on Team Kid and Team Trans or Team Non-Binary, even if they make mistakes, right? If they're doing the best they can, what we see is that their kids do so much better. And then the second graph really looks at some of those negative health outcomes, and it's the inverse, right? Those students or those kids who had those supportive parents have much lower reported rates of depression and much lower risk for suicide compared to those who had less or not supportive parents who have very significantly high rates of depression and suicide. And so I think that's where, again, groups like P4P, where you can figure it out and get support for yourself and figure out how to do that for your kids, and get all your questions answered and get all the willies out and the things that make it hard to be your best parent, right? So that then you can take home the best version of parent for your kid. And when I look at this data right here, I can't figure out how anybody could do it in a different way, because the way that you parent, while I would never ever say to a parent, you did that wrong and that's why your kid died, I can say to parents, you did that right and that's why your kid made it through those struggles. And that's really important.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's undeniable that parents play. I mean, we started saying this, like having a safe home environment, having parents that are listening to you and believe you and are supporting your authentic self and expression and helping you get access to the necessary medical and psychological resources that you need is critical for any child's well-being, but especially for trans and non-binary youth. So let's see, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. One, which is easy, we've touched on a little bit. Oh, let me stop sharing the screen. Is the availability of P4P to folks that live in other areas of Missouri. So you all have talked a little bit about the Facebook group, which is obviously accessible to anybody, but are there ways that folks from around Missouri could plug in with P4P? Are y'all doing Zoom meetings right now?
Actually, Cameron, we occasionally do Zoom meetings. Okay. We're trying to meet in person just because it has such a better vibe, but we do have some members that live sort of far away. So periodically we work in a Zoom meeting. So yes, I guess we should say that we do some Zoom meetings, not on a real regular basis, but some, yes.
Cool. And I do want to direct, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, definitely join the Facebook group, because we do share a lot of information and resources and support through that. So anybody can join that who is a parent of an LGBTQ child, or I believe a grandparent or family member. And we do a lot of sharing of information there.
Yeah, there's like active communication that happens on the Facebook, from what I understand. We had another question that came through. I don't know if y'all panelists are able to see it in your chat, about social motivation around transition. Is that something that anybody would want to respond to?
I'm happy to respond to that. And I think most of us, when our child first came out, we have these questions and concerns that maybe it's more of a social pressure or an attention, or they are just not quite sure about themselves. And that's hardly ever the case. None of us have ever had a child come back and say, that wasn't the case, that they aren't transgender. It might feel that way at first, just because this is so new and different and confusing to the parent. And it's just very hard to grasp and understand that your child is not what you had perceived. And it is very easy to see that they are getting a lot of attention and from others, And from the schools, if you're in Columbia Public Schools, they have done an awesome job at this point. Those of you that don't know, they have a process in place if your child is transgender to help with name change, pronouns, all of that. So it is easy to see that that might be enticing for a child, but nobody puts themselves through this just for the attention. This is a hard road for our kids. And so I do understand that initial thought process. I went through it, my husband went through it. But really, if your child is telling you this, it's real. So.
Yeah, it's a super common question. In fact, I really would, we pulled together a bunch of resources for this presentation. I really would encourage folks to check those out because that is a frequently responded to question on like FAQs and things like that. So we're already at 8:05 and I definitely want to be respectful of everybody's time because this is a 1-hour presentation. And so not seeing any other questions in the chat, I wanted to, I guess, if the panel wants to share anything else, but if not, I want to pass it back to the library.
Well, I'd just like to thank all of you for being here tonight. I can see where, in my mind, there could be part 2, part 3, so not to put any pressure on anybody, but I can see where the first presentation raises a lot of questions and ideas for another presentation as we continue down the road. So I did put the next workshop with Children's Grove in the chat that will not be recorded, and I wanted to make sure people realize that. But it's question, persuade, and refer suicide prevention training. So that anybody can come to that, and it'll be on Zoom as well. But thank you all for coming this evening. I will send out the recording to folks that were registered but were unable to be here tonight so that they will still have access and have a reminder that it's out there, and then people can share it as well. So thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.